The massive crystal dome stretched across 3 kilometers of space, housing the most important meeting in the galaxy. Inside the Galactic Council Station, 47 different species gathered every month to discuss threats, trade disputes, and territorial claims. The station orbited the gas giant Kepler 442b, far from any single species' homeworld, neutral ground for all. Ambassador Zixithera stood at the central podium, her 6 arms moving in the traditional Valonian greeting pattern. The other representatives watched from their specialized seating areas, each designed for different body types and atmospheric needs. Some breathed methane, others required high gravity, and a few existed as energy beings contained in crystalline shells. The quarterly threat assessment shows familiar patterns, Zixithera announced, her translator converting her clicks and whistles into each species' native language. The Krillian Empire has expanded into 2 more systems in the Outer Rim. The Void Runners continue their raids on shipping lanes near the Horsehead Nebula. 3 colonies in the Vega sector have declared independence from their founding species. The report continued for 2 hours, covering pirates, rebels, territorial disputes, and trade wars. Every representative took notes, calculating how each threat might affect their own interests. This was how the galaxy worked. Constant vigilance against countless dangers, each species protecting itself from all the others. On page 47 of the thick digital report, a single paragraph mentioned something new. A species called humans, from a small planet in the Orion Arm, had achieved faster-than-light travel. Their technology was crude but functional, using basic fusion drives and primitive navigation systems. Early scans suggested they were typical, aggressive, territorial, and likely to cause problems once they expanded beyond their home system. The paragraph received no discussion. New species appeared every few years, most causing minor troubles, before settling into the established patterns of galactic civilization. The humans seemed unremarkable, just another young race stumbling into space travel before they understood its complexities. Captain Jake Morrison had no idea his ship was being watched as the new frontier dropped out of hyperspace near the edge of Council territory. His crew of 12 had been exploring for 6 months, mapping trade routes and looking for habitable worlds. They were humanity's first deep space expedition, funded by a coalition of Earth governments desperate to find resources for their growing population. "Captain, we're picking up energy signatures," called out Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez from her engineering station. "Big ones. Something's out there." Jake studied the readings on his command screen. The signatures were unlike anything in Earth's databases, clearly artificial but using technologies humans had never seen. "Are they moving toward us?" "No, sir. Holding position about 50,000 kilometers away." "Wait, I'm getting a communication signal." The main screen flickered, then displayed something that made the entire bridge crew fall silent. An alien face looked back at them, reptilian but intelligent, with large golden eyes and scales that shifted color as they watched. When it spoke, the words came through their universal translator as heavily accented but understandable English. "Human vessel, I am Commander Veltar of the Galactic Council patrol ship Harmony. You have entered Council space. Please state your intentions." Jake stood up slowly, his heart racing, but his voice steady. "Commander Veltar, I'm Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth vessel New Frontier. We're explorers from the planet Earth, conducting our first deep space mission. We mean no harm to anyone." Veltar's head tilted slightly, a gesture that somehow seemed universal for curiosity. "Earth? Yes, we have a basic file on your species. You achieved faster-than-light travel. Recently. That's right, about a year ago. We're still learning how everything works out here." The conversation that followed changed everything, though neither Jake nor Veltar realized it at the time. Instead of the usual formal diplomatic protocols, Jake simply asked questions. "How does the Galactic Council work? What are the rules for traveling through different territories? Are there trade opportunities for new species?" Veltar found himself answering directly, without the careful political language he usually used. The human seemed genuinely interested in learning, not in probing for weaknesses or calculating advantages. When Jake asked, What's the best way for us to introduce ourselves to other species? Veltar actually smiled. Captain Morrison, would you be interested in visiting our central station? The Council always welcomes new species, and your approach to first contact is quite refreshing. 3 days later, the New Frontier docked at the Council station. Jake and his crew stepped into a world beyond their imagination. The docking bay, alone, was larger than most Earth cities, filled with ships of every conceivable design. Creatures that looked like walking crystals worked alongside beings made of living metal. The air itself shimmered with translation fields, converting countless languages into understandable communication. Amy Rodriguez stared at the station's power systems with professional fascination. Captain, look at this setup. They're running massive energy loads through what looks like a single conduit system. That should be impossible. A nearby Valonian engineer overheard her comment and approached. You understand our power grid? Well, not exactly, Amy replied, but I can see the energy flows. You're getting massive losses in the transfer points. Have you tried routing the power through multiple smaller conduits instead of one big one? The engineer's color changed to what Jake would later learn indicated excitement. We have struggled with power efficiency for over 3 centuries. Our greatest minds have studied this problem. You suggest a solution so simple? Amy shrugged. Sometimes the simple answer is the right one. Back on Earth, we learned that distributed systems often work better than centralized ones. Maybe you could try turning sections off and on again to see where the losses really happen. Within hours, Amy found herself working with a team of engineers from 6 different species. Her suggestion to systematically test each section of the power grid revealed problems that had been hidden for decades. By the end of the day, the station was running at 23% higher efficiency. Word spread quickly through the station. The new species didn't just ask good questions, they found practical solutions. When Dr. Kevin Walsh, the expedition's medical officer, suggested that the station's hospital could improve patient care by actually asking patients what hurt instead of just running standard scans, the medical staff was shocked by how obvious it seemed once someone said it. Jake spent his time meeting with various representatives, and each conversation followed the same pattern. Instead of the complex diplomatic discussions they expected, he asked simple, direct questions. What do you need? What problems are you trying to solve? How can we help? The directness was disturbing to species accustomed to layers of meaning and hidden agendas. When the Krillian trade representative tried to probe Jake's military intentions, Jake simply said, "We don't have any. We're here to explore and learn. If we find good trading partners along the way, even better." The Krillian spent 3 hours trying to find the hidden meaning in those words, convinced no species could be that straightforward. Meanwhile, Jake was already making friends with representatives from a dozen other species, all drawn to his honest approach to conversation. By the time the New Frontier left the Council station 2 weeks later, everything had changed. The humans hadn't brought superior technology or military might. They had brought something more dangerous, the assumption that different species could work together simply because it made sense. 6 months after the New Frontier's visit, reports about humans flooded into the Council chambers from across the galaxy. Trading posts that had operated the same way for centuries suddenly found themselves adapting to something called customer service. Human merchants actually asked what buyers wanted instead of simply offering what they had available. Captain Lisa Parker ran a small trading operation between 3 star systems, carrying manufactured goods from industrial worlds to agricultural colonies. Her approach baffled established traders who had spent decades learning the complex web of trade regulations, tariffs, and diplomatic requirements that governed galactic commerce. "I don't understand why this has to be so complicated," Lisa told the harbor master at Kepler Station. "The farmers on Tau Ceti need manufacturing equipment, and the factories on Rigel Prime need food. Why can't we just connect them directly?" The harbor master, a 4-armed Centaurian named Kelvar, stared at her with all 4 of his eyes. Because the Tau Ceti farmers belong to the Agricultural Collective, which has exclusive trading rights with the Vegan Consortium. The Rigel factories are owned by Industrial Holdings, which only deals through the Central Trade Authority. You cannot simply ignore centuries of established relationships. But what if we could make everyone more money by doing it differently? Lisa asked. What if the farmers could get better equipment for less cost and the factories could get fresher food for lower prices? Within 3 months, Lisa's direct trading approach had revolutionized commerce in her sector. By focusing on what people actually needed instead of traditional trade routes, she increased profits for everyone while reducing costs. Other traders began copying her methods, asking customers what they wanted instead of assuming they knew. Dr. Susan Blake prepared for the most important speech of her career. As humanity's first official representative to the Galactic Council, she was supposed to deliver a formal introduction covering human culture, biology, and intentions. The speech had been written by a team of Earth's best diplomats, carefully crafted to avoid offending any of the 47 member species. Standing before the assembled representatives in the Great Chamber, Susan looked at the prepared text one more time, then set it aside. Honored members of the Galactic Council, I'm supposed to tell you about humanity today. But first I have a question for all of you. The chamber fell silent. In 3,000 years of council meetings, no species had ever opened their introduction with a question, "Why are you all so afraid of each other?" The reaction was immediate and explosive. The Krillian representatives' war paint actually changed color. The Valonian delegation began rapid-fire clicking that their translators couldn't keep up with. Several species demanded that Susan be removed from the chamber immediately. High Counselor Mordeth called for order, but Susan continued speaking. I've been here for 2 weeks, attending your committee meetings and diplomatic functions. Every conversation I hear is about protecting yourself from someone else. Every trade deal includes clauses about what happens if trust breaks down. Every treaty assumes someone will eventually break it. This is outrageous, declared Ambassador Thrix of the Altarian Federation. The human questions the foundation of galactic civilization itself. No, Susan replied. I'm questioning whether fear has to be the foundation. On Earth, we have countries that used to fight each other for thousands of years. Now they work together because they discovered that cooperation benefits everyone more than conflict. The Centaurian representative stood up, his voice carrying across the chamber. Your species is young and naive. When you have seen civilizations rise and fall, when you have watched allies become enemies overnight, you will understand why caution is necessary. Susan nodded respectfully. You may be right. But what if you're wrong? What if all this fear and caution is preventing something better? The debate that followed lasted 14 hours and changed nothing officially. But in the weeks afterward, representatives began having different conversations. Some species started asking why they maintained certain defensive positions. Others questioned whether traditional enemies were still actually threats. Commander Rick Stevens faced a problem that had stumped galactic diplomats for 800 years. The Tau Ceti system contained 2 inhabited worlds, each controlled by a different species. The aquatic Selkies lived on Tau Ceti Prime, a water world covered in shallow seas. The silicon-based rocklings inhabited Tau Ceti II, a dry world of canyons and mineral deposits. For centuries, both species had claimed exclusive rights to the asteroid belt between their worlds. Thousands of negotiations had failed. 3 wars had been fought. The current ceasefire was maintained by a complex arrangement of patrol zones, mining quotas, and compensation payments that satisfied no one. Explain to me again why you need the asteroids, Rick asked the Selkie commander, a being who looked like a cross between a seal and a dolphin. The asteroids contain rare metals essential to our technology, the Selkie replied through her water-filled helmet. Without them, our civilization will stagnate. Rick turned to the rockling representative, a creature that resembled a walking pile of living gemstones. And you need them because? The asteroids contain pure silicon compounds that we require for reproduction, the rockling responded in a voice like grinding stone. Without them, our species faces extinction. So you both need different materials from the same asteroids? Both. Representatives stared at him as if he had said something incredibly stupid. Of course they needed different materials. That was why they were fighting. Have you ever actually divided up the asteroids and checked what's in each one? The question created a moment of perfect silence. In 800 years of conflict, no one had ever suggested simply cataloging what resources existed where. Both species had assumed the asteroids were uniform in composition. The survey took 3 weeks. The results showed that 70% of the asteroids were silicon-rich and perfect for rockling needs, while 30% contained the rare metals the Selkies required. The two species had been fighting over resources that could easily supply both civilizations for thousands of years. Agent Lisa Parker worked in the Council's Intelligence Division, a department that officially didn't exist. Her job involved monitoring threats to galactic stability, which mostly meant tracking which species were planning to betray which other species and when. The work required subtle investigation techniques, careful analysis of diplomatic communications, and years of training in alien psychology. Lisa's current assignment involved a suspected manipulation of rare Earth prices by 3 major trading species. The investigation had been ongoing for 5 years, with teams of analysts trying to piece together evidence from thousands of encrypted communications and financial records. Lisa took a different approach. She called the suppliers directly and asked why their prices kept changing. "Well," said the Andromedan mining supervisor, "the Galactic Trade Consortium keeps telling us demand is fluctuating. They say we need to adjust prices to match market conditions. Do you see the demand fluctuations in your actual sales?" "Not really. We sell the same amounts every month. But the consortium handles all our distribution, so they must know something. We don't." 3 more calls revealed the same pattern. The suppliers saw steady demand, but were told to adjust prices based on market reports they never saw. The distributors were told that supply was unstable and needed to charge variable rates to manage risk. The end buyers were told that rare Earth materials were becoming scarce and should expect higher costs. Lisa's simple investigation revealed a conspiracy that had operated successfully for over 50 years. 3 species had been artificially manipulating prices to generate massive profits while keeping suppliers and buyers in the dark. The scheme was so basic that no one had thought to look for it. When Lisa presented her findings to the Council's Security Committee, the reaction was not what she expected. Instead of praise for solving a major case, the committee members seemed disturbed by her methods. "You contacted the suppliers directly?" asked the committee chair. "Without surveillance authorization? Without coordinating with the relevant intelligence services?" "I just asked them some questions," Lisa replied. "They were happy to answer." This approach is highly irregular. What if they had been part of the conspiracy? What if they had warned the guilty parties? Lisa realized that the intelligence services had been so focused on complex analysis and covert methods that they had forgotten the simplest approach of all: asking direct questions. The conspiracy had survived not because it was sophisticated, but because no one had thought to investigate it simply. The exposure of the rare Earth price manipulation sent shockwaves through galactic politics. Trade relationships that had seemed stable for decades suddenly looked suspicious. Species that had trusted each other for generations began questioning their partnerships. But the bigger shock was how easily humans had uncovered the truth. Every case, from trade disputes to territorial conflicts to financial crimes, humans achieved breakthrough results by asking obvious questions that no one else had thought to ask. The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified the established powers of the Galactic Council. Humans weren't just solving individual problems. 1 year after first contact, the changes were impossible to ignore. Everywhere humans established operations, the fundamental nature of problems shifted. Trade disputes that had lasted centuries resolved in weeks. Territorial conflicts that had consumed generations suddenly found practical solutions. The carefully balanced systems of galactic civilization were experiencing unprecedented disruption. Dr. Kevin Walsh sat in his temporary office aboard the Council station, reading reports that would have been considered impossible just months before. Crime rates had dropped by 1/3 in systems with human presence, not because of superior law enforcement or harsh punishments, but because humans kept asking criminals why they committed crimes in the first place. "Most of them are just trying to solve problems," explained Detective Carl Rogers, a human investigator, working with the Rigel security forces. The Altarian who was stealing food wasn't a career criminal. His family was hungry because he lost his job when the factory automated. Instead of arresting him, we helped him find work with the maintenance crews for the new automated systems. The Rigelian police chief, a crystalline being named Shardex, had initially been skeptical of human methods. On Rigel, we have always believed that punishment deters crime. The fear of consequences keeps citizens in line. But does it work? Carl had asked. How much time do you spend catching the same people doing the same crimes over and over? The question had led to an analysis that shocked the Rigelian government. Nearly 80% of their crimes were committed by repeat offenders who had never addressed the underlying reasons for their behavior. The expensive prison system was essentially a revolving door that solved nothing while consuming enormous resources. Carl's approach was radically different. Instead of waiting for crimes to happen and then catching criminals, he worked to understand why crimes occurred and eliminate those reasons. Within 6 months, petty theft in his district had dropped by 90%. More surprisingly, many former criminals had become productive citizens who actively helped prevent crime in their neighborhoods. Agent Lisa Parker found herself assigned to investigate something that shouldn't have existed: a conspiracy within the council's own administration. For decades, certain species had maintained power not through superior governance or beneficial policies, but through careful manipulation of information and resources. The investigation began when a junior administrator asked Lisa a simple question. Why do some species always seem to get better committee assignments than others? The pattern was subtle but consistent. Certain species received advance information about upcoming decisions, better representation on key committees, and preferential treatment in resource allocation. Lisa's investigation revealed a system of favoritism and information trading that had operated for centuries. Senior administrators from allied species shared confidential information, coordinated their votes on important issues, and used their positions to benefit their home worlds at the expense of others. The corruption wasn't criminal in the traditional sense. No laws were technically broken because the laws themselves had been written by the same species who were now manipulating them. The entire governmental structure was designed to benefit insiders while maintaining the appearance of fairness. How did no one notice this before? Asked Commander Dan Peterson, a human military advisor who had been brought in to review the security implications. Because everyone was doing it, Lisa replied. Every species that gained power used it to help their allies and hurt their enemies. It wasn't corruption. It was how the system was supposed to work. The species that weren't part of the inner circles just accepted that they would always be disadvantaged. The revelation sent shockwaves through the council. Species that had believed they were equal partners in galactic governance discovered they had been systematically excluded from real decision-making for generations. Others found that their trusted allies had been manipulating them for decades. Engineer Carol Davis received an assignment that seemed routine: conduct a security review of the council station's computer networks. As a cybersecurity specialist, she expected to find the usual problems: outdated software, weak passwords, and insufficient access controls. What she found instead was a surveillance system that monitored every species' activities within the station. Communication logs, meeting records, personal conversations, and private data were all being collected, analyzed, and shared among certain council members. This isn't security, Carol told the station administrator, a nervous Centaurian named Vextar. This is espionage. You're spying on your own member species. The monitoring systems are essential for maintaining stability, Vextar replied, his forearms gesturing defensively. We must know if any species is planning hostile actions against the others. But you're not looking for hostile actions, Carol said, displaying her analysis on the main screen. You're collecting everything: trade negotiations, scientific research, personal communications, cultural information. You're treating every member species like a potential enemy. The scope of the surveillance was staggering. For over 2 centuries, the Council had been systematically monitoring its own members, building detailed profiles of their capabilities, intentions, and weaknesses. The information was used to manipulate political outcomes, trade agreements, and diplomatic relationships. Carol's report revealed that the Council's entire governmental structure was built on mutual distrust rather than cooperation. Every species watched every other species, assuming that betrayal was inevitable and preparation was the only defense against it. Captain Sarah Mitchell commanded a joint task force assembled to address the growing piracy problem in the Vega sector. The Void Runners had been operating in the region for over a decade, raiding merchant ships and selling stolen goods through a network of corrupt dealers and officials. Previous anti-piracy operations had followed traditional military doctrine. Assemble overwhelming force, hunt down the pirates, and destroy their bases. The approach had limited success because new pirates replaced the old ones as soon as the task forces moved to other regions. Sarah took a different approach that horrified the Council's military advisors. Instead of deploying massive battle fleets, she took 3 small fast ships and began tracking the pirates' support network. Rather than focusing on the attacks themselves, she investigated who was buying stolen goods, who was supplying the pirates with weapons and fuel, and who was providing them with information about merchant ship movements. "This is not how galactic security operates," complained Admiral Zarthek of the Krillian battle fleet. "You cannot defeat enemies by avoiding direct confrontation. The pirates will see your small force as weakness and increase their attacks." "Maybe," Sarah replied. "But what happens to pirates when no one will buy their stolen goods, sell them fuel, or tell them where the merchant ships are traveling?" The answer became clear within 3 months. Cut off from their support network and unable to sell their stolen cargo, the Void Runner pirates found their operations unsustainable. Many abandoned piracy entirely and took legitimate jobs with the merchant shipping companies they had previously attacked. The few pirates who continued operating were easily captured because they no longer had sources of intelligence or safe harbors to retreat to. Sarah's task force had eliminated the piracy problem permanently while barely engaging in combat. Dr. Susan Blake was asked to mediate a crisis that threatened to tear the Council apart. The exposure of corruption, surveillance, and manipulation had created a breakdown in trust between species that had worked together for millennia. Traditional allies were questioning their relationships, and long-standing enemies were wondering if their conflicts had been artificially maintained. "The fundamental problem," Susan explained to an emergency session of Council leaders, "is that your entire civilization is built on the assumption that cooperation requires coercion. You believe that species will only work together if they're forced to by treaties, surveillance, and the threat of punishment." High Counselor Mordith's scales shifted to colors indicating deep disturbance. Without these safeguards, chaos would result. Species would pursue only their own interests, leading to conflict and possibly war. "But that's exactly what you have now," Susan pointed out. "Every species is pursuing their own interests, just through manipulation instead of open competition. The surveillance and treaties haven't created cooperation. They've created an elaborate system of mutual deception. The human analysis was devastating in its simplicity. The Galactic Council had achieved peace not through trust and mutual benefit, but through fear and careful balance of power. Every species was so busy watching for threats and planning counter-moves that they had forgotten how to actually work together." Susan's proposed solution was even more disturbing. What if species simply cooperated because it benefited everyone? What if trust was assumed until proven otherwise, rather than requiring constant verification? What if conflicts were resolved by addressing underlying needs, rather than managing competing demands? The question struck at the heart of Galactic's civilization. For thousands of years, the established order had been based on the certainty that different species could not truly trust each other. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was the largest gathering in recorded history. Representatives from all 53 member species attended, along with observers from dozens of non-aligned worlds. The official agenda listed human integration protocols, but everyone knew they were really deciding whether humanity represented an existential threat to galactic civilization. High Counselor Mordith presented the findings of a comprehensive study into human impact on galactic society. The statistics were undeniable and deeply disturbing to the established order. Crime rates had dropped by 34% in systems with human presence. Trade disputes had decreased by 67%. Technological advancement had accelerated by 400%. Resource allocation efficiency had improved by 45%. By every measurable standard, Human involvement had dramatically improved galactic civilization. These numbers represent unprecedented positive change, Mordeth acknowledged, his scales shifting through colors that indicated deep conflict. However, the study has also revealed patterns that threaten the fundamental stability of our governmental systems. The real data was more disturbing than the improvements. Humans were changing how other species thought about basic problems. Traders who worked with humans began asking customers what they actually wanted instead of selling what was traditionally available. Diplomats exposed to human negotiation styles started focusing on underlying needs rather than traditional bargaining positions. Engineers working alongside humans questioned fundamental assumptions about how systems should operate. Ambassador Thrix of the Altarian Federation stood to address the assembly. The human influence spreads like a virus of dangerous thinking. Our own citizens now question why we maintain expensive military defenses against species that have not threatened us in generations. They ask why we cannot simply trust our neighbors instead of constantly preparing for betrayal. Similar reports came from across the galaxy. The Centaurian Collective was experiencing internal debates about whether their complex bureaucracy was necessary or just traditional. The Rigelian Empire faced questions from citizens who wondered why their government needed to control so many aspects of daily life. The Andromedan Trade Union was dealing with demands for transparency that had never existed before. Detective Mike Foster had been investigating corruption within the Council's administration for 6 months, but his latest discovery shocked even him. The governmental structure itself was designed around the assumption that species could not trust each other. Every law, every protocol, every administrative procedure existed to prevent cooperation that might lead to dangerous alliances. The entire system is built on fear, Mike explained to the emergency committee reviewing his findings. Not fear of external threats, but fear of member species working together too effectively. Every safeguard is designed to limit cooperation rather than enable it. The evidence was overwhelming. Trade regulations made direct commerce between species difficult, forcing transactions through council-controlled intermediaries. Communication protocols required all diplomatic messages to be logged and reviewed. Resource-sharing agreements included so many restrictions and oversight requirements that most species found it easier to remain self-sufficient. These measures ensure stability, argued Councillor Velnine of the Tau Cetian Assembly. History shows us that unrestricted cooperation between species leads to powerful alliances that threaten smaller civilizations. Mike's response was characteristic of human directness. Has anyone actually tried unrestricted cooperation to see what happens? Or are you just afraid of finding out it works better? The question created an uncomfortable silence. In 3,000 years of galactic governance, no one had ever tested whether the restrictions were actually necessary. They had simply assumed that without careful controls, chaos would result. Captain Beth Collins received the Council's ultimatum while commanding the human settlement on New Geneva Colony. The document was formal and comprehensive, outlining guidance, protocols that would essentially make humanity a protectorate of the Galactic Council. The protocols were presented as necessary safeguards to help a young species integrate safely into galactic civilization. Humans would be limited to expanding into designated sectors. Their involvement in interspecies affairs would require Council approval. All human technological developments would be subject to review and potential restriction. Beth read the ultimatum, twice before calling her senior staff. They want us to accept limitations on everything we do in space. If we refuse, they're threatening economic sanctions and military action. Engineer Carol Davis looked up from her analysis of the document. Captain, these protocols aren't about protecting us or helping us integrate. Look at Section 12. They want to limit our communication with other species. Section 15 restricts our ability to share technological innovations. Section 23 requires Council oversight of our educational programs. The pattern was clear. The guidance protocols were designed to prevent humans from continuing to influence other species. The Council wasn't trying to help humanity integrate into galactic civilization. They were trying to isolate human ideas from the rest of the galaxy. Dr. Susan Blake was preparing humanity's official response when she discovered something that changed everything. While researching council precedents, she found records of similar ultimatums issued to other species throughout galactic history. The pattern was always the same. A young species would begin to influence others in ways the council found threatening, and would then be forced to accept restrictions or face isolation. The aquatic selkies were forced to limit their terraforming technology after it threatened established agricultural interests, Susan explained to Earth's leadership via quantum communication. The silicon rocklings had to restrict their mineral processing innovations when they began competing with traditional mining operations. The pattern weavers were prevented from sharing their advanced mathematics after their methods began replacing established computational systems. Every species that had brought genuinely innovative approaches to galactic problems had eventually been contained or controlled, not because their innovations were dangerous, but because they threatened the established order that kept certain species in positions of power. The Council doesn't fear human weapons or human aggression, Susan concluded. They fear human questions. They're terrified of a species that looks at thousand-year-old problems and asks why no one has fixed them yet. Colonel Dan Peterson commanded the defense forces for humanity's outer colonies when the Council's enforcement fleet appeared at the edge of human space. The fleet was massive, over 200 ships representing a dozen different species, more firepower than had ever been assembled for a single operation. Dan's orders from Earth were clear: avoid conflict if possible, but do not accept the guidance protocols under threat of force. Humanity would not be bullied into accepting restrictions on their natural approach to cooperation and problem-solving. Instead of preparing for battle, Dan did something characteristic of human thinking. He opened communication channels to every ship in the enforcement fleet and broadcast an invitation. Any species that's interested in exploring alternatives to the current galactic system is welcome to join us in creating something better. We're not trying to destroy the Council or force anyone to change, we're just offering a choice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Over half the ships in the enforcement fleet requested permission to open direct communication with human representatives. Species that had been forced to participate in the military action suddenly found themselves questioning why they were threatening people who had only helped them. Captain Jake Morrison, now serving as humanity's chief diplomatic representative, found himself conducting negotiations with dozens of species simultaneously. Each conversation followed the familiar pattern: species expressing frustration with the current system and curiosity about alternatives. The Galactic Council has maintained peace for 3,000 years, acknowledged Commander Veltar, who had become a close friend since their first meeting. But it is a peace built on fear and control. Your species offers something we have never seen: peace built on trust and mutual benefit. The enforcement fleet gradually dissolved as individual species made their own decisions about whether to support Council actions or explore human alternatives. Within days, what had been intended as a show of overwhelming force became a demonstration of how many species were ready for change. Admiral Zarthek of the Krillian battle fleet was one of the few commanders who maintained position, but even his communications revealed deep uncertainty. Human Admiral Collins, my government orders me to enforce Council decisions, but I have seen the results of your methods in my own sector. Crime has decreased, trade has improved, and our citizens are happier than they have been in generations. How do I choose between loyalty to the Council and what is clearly better for my people? Dr. Rachel Murphy arrived from Earth to serve as humanity's chief negotiator for what everyone knew would be the final confrontation. Her instructions were simple: offer alternatives, not ultimatums. Show that cooperation was possible without coercion, and let species make their own choices about which system they preferred. The final Council session took place in chaos that no one could have predicted. Half the member species demanded immediate restrictions on human expansion, arguing that human influence threatened the stability that had prevented galactic war for 3 millennia. The other half, inspired by months of exposure to human methods, demanded fundamental reforms to the Council structure itself. High Counselor Mordeth struggled to maintain order as representatives shouted across the Great Chamber in dozens of languages. The translation systems couldn't keep up with the rapid-fire debates, creating moments of confusion where species argued violently about points they actually agreed on. The human influence has created unprecedented instability, declared Ambassador Threeks, his Altarian battle crown extended in a display of aggression. Systems that have operated successfully for centuries are being abandoned based on untested theories about cooperation and trust. Commander Veltar stood to respond, his Valonian scales shifting to colors of calm determination. The human methods have solved problems in my sector that we believed were impossible to address. Crime rates have dropped, efficiency has improved, and our citizens report higher satisfaction with governance than ever before. How is this instability? The argument that followed revealed the fundamental divide that had split galactic civilization. Species that had benefited from human contact wanted more of the same. Species that had profited from the old system of complexity and controlled conflict wanted humanity contained before their entire power structure collapsed. Admiral Beth Collins received the final ultimatum while reviewing defensive preparations for the human colonies. The document was signed by 27 species and represented the hardline position that had emerged from the chaos of council debates. Humanity must accept guidance protocols limiting expansion, technological sharing, and diplomatic contact with other species, the ultimatum stated. Failure to comply within 30 standard days will result in economic sanctions, travel restrictions, and if necessary, military action to contain human influence. Beth called an emergency meeting of all human leaders in the sector. Captain Jake Morrison joined by quantum communication from the council station. Dr. Susan Blake connected from Earth. Colonel Dan Peterson reported from the military staging areas. The decision they made would determine humanity's future in the galaxy. They're not really afraid of our weapons or our expansion, Susan explained, her analysis of the situation cutting straight to the core issue. They're afraid that we've proven their entire system is unnecessarily complicated. For 3,000 years, they've maintained that species can't trust each other without elaborate controls. We've shown that's not true. Jake's report from the council station confirmed the deeper implications. Half the species here are ready to try something different. They've seen what direct cooperation can accomplish, and they want more of it. But the other half built their entire power structure on the assumption that complexity and control were necessary. If we're right about cooperation, their entire system becomes obsolete. The human response was crafted by Dr. Rachel Murphy, who had spent weeks in negotiations with species from both sides of the divide. Her statement was broadcast simultaneously to every world in the galaxy, translated into hundreds of languages, and transmitted through every communication network. The Galactic Council has given humanity a choice: accept restrictions on our natural approach to cooperation, or face isolation and conflict. But we think there's a third option that everyone has overlooked. What if species could choose their own approach to interstellar civilization? The broadcast continued with an invitation that shocked the galaxy. Any species that wants to join a new form of interstellar cooperation based on mutual trust rather than mutual fear is welcome to help us create an alternative to the current system. Any species that prefers the traditional council approach is free to continue with that system. We're not trying to destroy anything. We're just offering a choice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, over 30 species had officially accepted the invitation to join what became known as the Human Alliance. These weren't just small or powerless civilizations. Some of the galaxy's most advanced species chose to abandon the council system in favor of the human approach. Commander Veltar was among the first to announce his species' decision. The Valonian Confederation has voted to join the Human Alliance. We have seen the results of trust-based cooperation, and we choose to embrace it fully. The aquatic Selkies of Tau Ceti Prime followed quickly. Their representative, Admiral Shalthis, explained their decision in terms that resonated across the galaxy. For centuries, we have maintained expensive defenses against threats that existed only in our imagination. The humans have shown us that cooperation is more powerful than preparation for conflict. The Silicon Rocklings, the Andromedan Mining Collective, and dozens of other species made similar announcements. Each decision was based on practical experience with human methods rather than abstract political theory. These species had seen the results and chosen accordingly. But not everyone was ready for change. The Krillian Empire, the Altarian Federation, and several other major powers chose to remain with the traditional council system. Their decision was based on genuine philosophical differences about the nature of interstellar relations. The humans offer appealing theories, admitted Admiral Zarthek of the Krillian fleet. But our species has survived for millennia by preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. We cannot abandon proven methods for untested alternatives. The galaxy faced something unprecedented, a voluntary division into two completely different approaches to civilization. The traditional Galactic Council continued to operate based on treaties, surveillance, and careful balance of power. The new human alliance operated on direct communication, assumed trust, and practical problem-solving. Colonel Dan Peterson found himself commanding not a single defensive operation, but the coordination of dozens of species as they established new forms of cooperation. The logistics were challenging, but the enthusiasm was infectious. Species that had never worked together before found themselves collaborating on projects that benefited everyone involved. "We're not trying to prove the Council wrong," Dan explained to a gathering of Alliance military commanders. "We're just trying to prove that our way works. If it doesn't, we'll learn from that and try something else. If it does work, maybe more species will want to join us." The practical results spoke for themselves. Alliance territories experienced rapid improvements in trade efficiency, technological development, and conflict resolution. Problems that had persisted for decades in Council space found quick solutions when approached with human methods. Captain Sarah Mitchell established the first Joint Alliance patrol system, with ships from 12 different species working together to maintain security across multiple sectors. The traditional Council approach would have required months of negotiations to establish command structures, rules of engagement, and coordination protocols. Sarah's approach was simpler. Everyone patrol your traditional areas, but help each other when needed. Share information freely. When problems come up, we'll figure out solutions together. The system worked better than anyone expected. Piracy dropped to near zero levels as criminals found themselves facing coordinated responses from species that communicated instantly and openly. Trade flourished as barriers between alliance species were reduced or eliminated entirely. Dr. Susan Blake was asked to mediate a final meeting between Council and Alliance representatives. The session took place on a neutral station at the border between the two systems, with the goal of establishing peaceful coexistence rather than resolving their fundamental differences. "We represent two different answers to the same question," Susan explained to the assembled diplomats. "The question is, how do different species work together in space? The Council answer is careful control and mutual verification. The Alliance answer is direct communication and assumed good faith. Both answers might be right for the species that choose them." High Counselor Mordeth spoke for the Council position. "We do not oppose the human alliance's right to exist, but we question whether their methods can maintain stability over centuries rather than years. Trust is easily broken, and cooperation can become exploitation." Ambassador Jake Morrison replied for the Alliance. "You might be right about that, but we think it's worth finding out. If trust-based cooperation fails, we'll learn from that failure and try to do better. If it succeeds, maybe we'll prove that fear isn't the only foundation for peace." The agreement they reached was simple. Both systems would coexist and interact peacefully, but neither would try to force the other to change. Species could choose which system they preferred, and could even change their minds if experience showed them a better path. The final scene of the Great Transformation took place a year later, when Jake Morrison met his old friend Veltar at the same neutral station where the coexistence agreement had been signed. Veltar had remained with the Council system, but the friendship between the two individuals had survived their civilization's philosophical divide.